All right, welcome everyone to our first open forum with a CCAHA staff person. This afternoon we have Lee Price, our Director of Development at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. He is going to be here answering your questions about fundraising, grant opportunities, etc. This is part of a larger program, our Putting Best Practices into Practice Scalable Preservation Solutions webinar series that's going to be going on throughout 2019 and 2020. It is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And although this webinar is free, you are encouraged to register for the other programs, which will be there's information about on our website on the education program calendar. So please check those out and register for further programs. I think Lise might say a few more words about the series overall. I just wanted to say a really quick bit of housekeeping as to how this forum would work. So all of you participants out there cannot actually talk to us. You will be able to communicate via chatting, typing your questions or comments into the chat box that should be toward the middle of your screen. Lee, however, like me, you will be hearing Lee's voice, and so he'll be responding to your typed questions that way. So this is our first forum in this series, so please bear with any potential technical glitches, although I think we're going to move smoothly along. And with that, I'm just going to pass it right on over to Lee.
Hi, that was our passing over the headset from one of us to the other. We share a headset here. So we're all gathered here in Diani's office to do this here today. And as Diani was mentioning, my name is Lee Price. I'm the Director of Development here at the Conservation Center. And this is the very first time that anybody has done a forum like this. I finally gotten used to the webinar format. In the beginning, I was doing webinars on fundraising. In the beginning, I attempted to do them the way I actually do workshops, and where there's so much give and take between what I'm presenting and what the audience specifically wants to get down to hearing about their own particular needs. There's a lot of give and take with that, and you really can't generally do that in a webinar. So I've gotten used to now having much more strictly, I write out the webinars and have a real script with the webinars, unlike the way I do workshops. And this webinar is very different for me because I'm operating without a script. I feel completely like I'm operating without a net in this case, probably taking questions that I am not anticipating at all. In many cases, probably questions that normally I would field with an email, do some research on, and get back to you, or maybe have a phone discussion with you at a later date. And instead today, I feel like I'm doing this, operating it as an acrobat without a net underneath me. I hope I will be able to answer this. So if we'll just start from the very beginning. If you have some fundraising questions that you're coming to this forum hoping to get an answer to, you can enter them now. You don't wait for me to stop talking, just go ahead and start entering them at any time. I did want to mention that this is one of the very first events, I guess after the Facebook Live that Diani and Samantha Forsco did just recently, launching our Putting Best Practices into Practice, Scalable Preservation Solutions, a new program that we're doing here at the Conservation Center. And it's a real combination of bi-monthly webinars with combined with this type of forum. And just please do look into that. In March, we have coming up different models for success, getting started, good and better versus striving for best, which is I think a real theme for the whole thing. The first webinar that we're doing here is capturing a lot of the spirit of putting best practices into practice, because it's going to be dealing with a key idea that I think will run throughout all of them, including this today, very much so. That the way to address collection stewardship is by incremental improvements to have a very good sense of where you are right now and what would be the next improvement that you should give some real thoughtful time on and maybe some fundraising on in order to make those improvements in collections care. But just taking it, basically how to reduce it to one bite-size project at a time, rather than just get overwhelmed by everything you should do. So it's trying to find the projects and to line them up in order and work on incremental improvements, primarily really looking at small to mid-sized collecting institutions. So that's all coming up, and you can find that on our website with the information on what the first 6 webinars will be, and also registration, so you can sign up for the entire 2019 webinar series. That's definitely the way to go. And you sign up for the whole webinar series at a discount, and you can get a certificate of completion, or you can just register per webinar if there are a few that are sounding particularly appropriate for your institution. Once again, I'll keep emphasizing that if you are coming to this with questions that you'd like me to be stump the presenter, please just put them up on the chat box and we'll see how things go. Some areas that I'm interested in, particularly at the moment. Well, my expertise from 18 years here at the Conservation Center, working with a lot of collecting institutions on their preservation and conservation projects, trying to find funding for them. My expertise is mainly in helping organizations with federal grant programs. And there have been a few changes in the past couple of years and past few years that I did want to just highlight, so you can be thinking about them and ways that you can take advantage of them. One that just passed is the preservation assistance grants for smaller institutions that NEH runs. And preservation assistance grants for many years has been at the $6,000 level. When you can go for a preservation assistance grant, they're now due in January. You can go for a preservation assistance grant for $6,000 for a complete preservation project, like say getting a preservation needs assessment by having a preservation professional come and prepare one of those based on your particular collection care environment. So for ages, that's been $6,000 that you can go for projects, but just this past year with this January deadline, they went up to $10,000. So that is something new in the federal area, is that preservation assistance grants, you can now go for up to $10,000 for your preservation project, as opposed to the former limit of $6,000. Also, some breaking news that just found out over this weekend was that with the government shutdown ending and the large bill getting signed by the president, the omnibus bill for funding in 2019, for the third time, I guess, in a row, the funding bill somehow has included Save America's Treasures funding. This has been a category. When I came to the Conservation Center back in 2001, Save America's Treasures had just started, and it was a very important federal funding category that the National Park Service runs, a very important category for getting a lot of, especially conservation treatment work done on collections throughout the country. And that program ran quite successfully from 2001 to 2010, and then it was removed from the budget, and it never officially left as a government program, but it became an unfunded government program. And now for the last three budget bills that have gone through, money has almost mysteriously, delightfully appeared for Save America's Treasures funding again. Not at the levels that it was from 2001 to 2010. Back in those days, I think they had around 15 million to disperse, and now they're just down to around 5 million per cycle. But still, just a delight to have Save America's Treasures back in play as one of the several federal funding opportunities for collections to be looking at. I also wanted to mention about this is more on the latest in federal funding opportunities. NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities, has a they've had this category called Humanities Collections and Reference Resources for a long time, as well as a Sustaining Cultural Collections or Sustaining Cultural Heritage category, I think it's called. So there are these two large categories: the Sustaining Cultural Heritage, covering the collections care environment, things like HVAC systems, funding for them, large expensive improvements. And the other one, the Humanities Collections and Reference Resources, is the main one that I've worked on with a number of institutions, where they've looked for funding for cataloging, finding aids, conservation treatment, and digitization. It's a category that's very much about making collections accessible, particularly since it's NEH. Particularly, the emphasis has been in making these collections accessible to researchers. They're much more concerned about that than they are with how many people you're getting through the door to look at an exhibition. NEH likes that access to researchers. So I'll just mention about the Humanities Collections and Reference Resources, because as I was saying, that's the one that I've really been involved with, trying to help some institutions get funding for it. Around 3 years ago, Humanities Collections and Reference Resources added a new subcategory called HCRR, that's Humanities Collections and Reference Resources, HCRR Foundations. And the HCRR Foundations subcategory is for planning projects. And these planning projects can be for, you can go for up to $50,000 in funding, and they ask for a little match, but it's a fairly minor match, one that's most institutions are it's a pretty easy match to make. The match is, they usually ask for around a 20% match. So with a $50,000, if you get $50,000, basically you have to raise around $12,000 as your match, and that match in this category can usually be done by in-kind staff time. So it's actually not looking outward for any it's not, you don't actually have to send out the appeals for funding. Your in-kind donation of time is sufficient to cover the match in most cases. That's for the HCRR Foundations grant, which sets you up for a large planning project with, with $50,000. What we've been doing is frequently working on projects that involve a large-scale collection survey where we're getting a conservator out to the collection to go through, in many cases, an item-by-item collection survey, going through the whole thing. And I have sort of my first question here too from Beverly Sutley, so I'll get to that in just a second. With HCRR Foundations grants, they set you up for a large implementation grant. See, if you get the collection survey can be looking at getting condition reports for objects in your collections that you might consider at risk. And we also have been working with organizations to set up little panels of humanities professionals who have a real interest in the areas that are covered by their collections in order to prioritize, make digitization priorities for their collections. And then what we're basically setting up here for with this is the planning grant. Through the planning grant, we figure out what probably will need conservation treatment, or in some cases really desperately needs conservation treatment before it goes through the manhandling involved in digital imaging. And it's setting you up for that implementation grant from the Humanities Collections and Reference Resources category. You get the Foundations grant for the planning, you do the plan, usually over a 2-year period, and then you flip it over into a request for a Humanities Collections and Reference Resources implementation grant, where you can actually get some treatment done and a large deal of digital imaging done as well. And we followed this route very successfully with one organization. We're working with the Moravian Archives on a project right now that they flipped over from, they did the planning through the HCRR Foundations, and then got both an NEH, Humanities Collections and Reference Resources Implementation Grant, and a Council on Library and Information Resources, a CLEAR grant, to help with the digitization. So we had complete success with the Moravian Archives, and we're also working with Historic Huguenot Street up in New York now on the planning project. We helped them get we assisted with the grant preparation on the planning project that's underway right now, with the whole idea that we'll just flip it into the implementation grant down the road. And we're also in the process of waiting to hear on a couple of other institutions that have recently planned for the same process. So it seems like NEH is fairly open to this approach of doing the planning and then flipping it into an implementation project that it's been preparing you for. I've been talking about Humanities Collections and Reference Resources. All that I've just mentioned is entirely applicable to the sustaining cultural collections grants as well, where you're looking more at bringing in experts on collections care environment to give you recommendations on how you can improve the environment. Then you go for the implementation grant after that, in order to get the HVAC system. Okay, I'm going to take some questions now. Beverly Sutley asked about funding for a new facility and housing for collection objects. Funding for new facilities, I really can't cover much at all. That's going to be outside of the whole federal domain. Most of the, I was mentioning about the sustaining grants that do address the environment for collections, and they can be used you can use the grants for preparation, for preparing for determining what kind of facility, what kind of environment would be most appropriate for the items that you have. But then when it comes to a new facility, you're looking at a capital campaign basically, and that's usually almost entirely going through um, um, local and regional sources, more places that you're hoping you'll have some board connections for. The housing for collections objects can be we have funding for a new facility. Are there grants available for furniture housing within this facility? At the very smallest level, you can go for housing, lots of housing supplies for through preservation assistance grants for smaller institutions. They, especially you do on a request for the rehousing supplies, they should be recommended in a by an outsider, use a preservation professional who would recommend that in their preservation needs assessment. Or if you don't have the preservation needs assessment, you really want to go for $10,000 worth of housing supplies to keep you busy for a while. You can just you can see if you can get a preservation professional to write basically a letter to just say that you do need this. That this is you would need an outsider in the business saying that this is a true need of your organization at this time. It's a natural next step for your organization. If you need a lot of major furniture, if you're looking for major furniture purchases, I would be looking at NEH sustaining cultural. I wish I could remember if it was sustaining cultural collections or sustaining cultural heritage, but it starts with sustaining, and you can go for some of the larger furniture requests through that category as well. Marga Silvestra, and I apologize if I butcher names, I probably will throughout this, asked about post-disaster conservation projects. There is interest in, let me see, there has, a lot depends on what kind of institution is asking this question, because there's museum money in IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services. They have two different divisions, a division for museum services and a division for library services. The museum services is quite interested in post-disaster, but that's only, I'm talking to collecting institutions on this forum who some of them are academic archives, and academic archives are not eligible through the museum grants. They're considered libraries, so it's through the Division of Library Services, and the Division of Library Services does not have that much for this, while the Division for Museum Services with post-disaster is usually quite generous and has quite a bit. So a lot depends on what your institution is. Can you go through the museum category through IMLS? You'd be eligible for some good stuff. If not, you'd probably be more if you were an academic archive, you're kind of in that area. You're in NEH. You're in National Endowment for the Humanities, and then you have to make your particular project fit into what they're doing. And then it depends very much on what kind of an institution you are. There are a number of humanity initiatives available, humanity initiatives grants available within NEH for some special types of institutions. There are humanities initiatives for the HBCUs, the historically Black colleges and universities, that can be used for the post-disaster projects. There are tribal, Native American tribal colleges and university. There's Hispanic serving. There's a category for Hispanic serving institutions. And all of those are pretty open to funding for post-disaster conservation projects. Mold remediation, I usually do not recommend going to federal for mold remediation because you should have somebody come in and look at it immediately to know if the extent to which this is an immediate emergency, if you have to be freezing things, whatever. You really want a conservator in to look at the collections immediately if you have a mold problem, which means trying to find for mold remediation, I usually recommend going local. Once again, board connections or I mean, it's an emergency. You have to deal with it. It's an important in order to preserve your collections. You should be working as quickly as possible, and the turnaround for the federal grants is just too long to make me comfortable. So I'd much rather see you going with local and regional foundation requests, major donor requests, rather than going the federal route with mold remediation. We have people coming in and out all the time, attendees. The way this for people who have arrived recently, if you are coming with a question, I imagine that you are, please enter your question in the chat box. Don't be afraid to type enough to give me some information on where this is, you know, how helpful this will be, because it's very helpful. If we were on the phone, I usually spend around 10 minutes grilling whoever I'm talking to find out you know, what kind of a collecting institution they are, what their operating budget is. I don't expect all this information here, but I'm just letting you know it's the more information somebody like me has, the more helpful I can be in providing recommendations and ideas on places that you could be looking for funding. I did mention about the problem of libraries and archives, specifically really academic archives probably have it most rough of all, and that there aren't that many federal funding sources available for this. Mainly we just try and work the NEH possibilities as much as possible, because that split in IMLS between museum services and library services leaves museums much more eligible for being able to apply for funds for collection stewardship projects than archives just don't have as many federal categories that they can go through for raising the federal funds. I was mentioning before about a couple of new grants that are emerging, and I did have another one to mention here. There, IMLS, the museum side of IMLS, put a new grant out this year in 2018 called their Inspire grants, Inspire with an exclamation point, which are offering up to $50,000 in funding that does not need to be matched, no match required. So it's a just wonderful opportunity here for a major collection stewardship project. It's structured, the new Inspire category is structured very much like the other IMLS category that's existed for a long time called Museums for America. It's basically the same categories. There are three categories. There's learning experiences, something else, and the one I'm interested in, the collection stewardship and accessibility category, and all my work falls in the collection stewardship in the collection stewardship arena. So IMLS Inspire came up with their the new category in 2018, and the deadline was on November 1st. I'm hoping that it will be back entirely again, because it's a wonderful opportunity for museums, and only museums, to pursue some great, fairly large collection stewardship projects. Okay, I have a couple of questions here. Lou asks, is there a place where the topics of today's, yeah, okay, so Deani answered that question about where this will be available. And Kathy asked about funding for HVAC planning and installation for a historic structure. Yeah, you might have come in a little late on that. The planning for the installation is an NEH sustaining cultural heritage grant. I think it's cultural heritage. I've been hemming and hawing on the exact title of that grant category, and they are very concerned with getting experts in to do the planning for the environmental planning for getting good collections care environments. And so you can go for through the NEH Humanities Collections and Reference, no, Humanities Collections, I'm sorry, NEH Sustaining Cultural Heritage. You can go for a $50,000 planning project that only requires a small match. That match can be in-kind staff assistance, so you don't have to do any outside fundraising on these planning grants. So you can go for the NEH, Managed Collections and Reference Resources Sustaining Grants, in order to do the planning for HVAC for historic structure, particularly the protecting the collections within a historic structure. That's what they're very interested in. But you can get some, for $50,000, you can get some great professionals in to do the planning. And from the planning, you can probably flip it over to an implementation grant in the same category for a great deal more money. You'd probably go for up to around $350,000 in an application, because addressing something like HVAC can be quite expensive. For the federal categories, you could do funding for HVAC for a museum through Museums for America as well. And actually, the Inspire category, you could look into that as well. I mean, $50,000, yeah, you could do fund. I have a feeling they would cover a lot of consultation for the planning of the HVAC system. Pretty sure that would be covered in there. I don't have the guidelines in front of me right now, and this is some of these grant categories are things I usually don't go for, because most of the assistance that I provide here at the Conservation Center is pretty set on projects that include conservation treatment or digital imaging. So when it comes for actually planning for HVAC, I sometimes give some advice on it, and I'll sometimes look at some applications for it, but I'm never involved in the whole planning and preparation of those grant requests. I'm a little bit off to the side on them. Okay, Erin has a longer statement here. Our local historical society museum applied for a California Preservation Assessment Program assessment twice and were rejected twice. Is there any help for this institution who keeps getting rejected because their collections are not cataloged? My sense is that they are so far behind, volunteer run as many of these organizations are, that they're beyond help. This seems really sad to me. They have unique archives and artifacts, many of the best treasures of our town. I work at the library and the local I would like to see their collections preserved. Okay. Trying to find, the Preservation Assessment Program in California would have seemed to be the ideal place to go. I'm speaking from Pennsylvania here, but I know in New Jersey, they have a great program for historical societies to go for this type of assessment. They regularly give them to the volunteer-run historical societies. So I'm very sad to hear that California is not quite as open to that as they are. Um, as they are in New Jersey. But that said, the big thing isn't really the cataloging of the collections. The major concern among institutions is whether or not your collections are inventoried. The essential thing is to know, where the artifacts are in what you have and where it's located within the collection. Once you've got the inventory done, the preservation needs assessment seems to be the natural thing to move on to, and cataloging and higher level cataloging can really be a step after the preservation needs assessment. I'm quite comfortable with that. That said, most of the you can go for, okay, it would help to try and get the Historical Society Museum to invest in a strategic plan so they can start figuring out how they can raise money effectively in the future. And if all your funding sources that you would normally go through, if the state funding sources are requesting basically that you need to have an employee or a part-time employee, usually it's a full-time equivalent. When you go for a preservation NEH preservation assistance grant for small institutions, the requirement from NEH is just full-time equivalent. If you have a volunteer who's putting in a full-time hours, or if you have two volunteers who are each putting in part-time hours, that comes to full-time equivalent, you can go for one of the NEH grants. Now, one of the NEH preservation assistance grants for smaller institutions. And with that, you can go for the preservation needs assessment that Erin's asking about here. So you just have to figure out if you have to start structuring your planning project. And I would say, getting them to invest in a strategic plan is a great way to do this, because you can start figuring out the steps that you need in order to be requesting funding from fairly professional sources like like NEH or like the California programs. What do you have to do in order to be in a position where you can be asking for that money? Now, if the problem is that the Historical Society Museum is not inventoried and you need to either inventory the collection yourself, or if you want to get a professional in to do it, that is not something that most funding sources will give you money for. Inventory is sort of that's the very first step in taking care of your collections, is knowing what you have and where it is. So they should know that this is their first obligation, is to create an inventory of their collections. And from that, they should be able to move on for going for a preservation needs assessment. They should be able to go on to higher level cataloging, other things from that point. But you really do have to do that first. They do not know everything they have or where it is. I just consider that so essential that the board has to realize that they have to invest their time into doing that. So it's not going to happen before they can apply for a grant. Yeah. they just have to take it that seriously that they have to sit down. They have to put a couple of weekends together to the project of creating the inventory of what they have. So, yeah, if you haven't been able to convince them, tell them I told them I'm telling them they have to do that. That they have a responsibility. Look, if you're a nonprofit, if you are a nonprofit of if your collecting institution is a nonprofit, part of what you're agreeing to legally is to provide the best possible care for your collections. And part of that care, well, in order to do that care, you have to know what you have and you have to know where it is. If, God forbid, there's a fire in your institution and you've lost stuff, if you don't have the inventory, they don't know what they've lost. They don't know what was there. So it's really their responsibility to practice the best stewardship possible, and the bare minimum of good stewardship is knowing where you have, what you have, and where it is. Okay, I think did I miss a question here? I hope not. I have the same problem in McCain County, although most everything we have is catalog. Once you have everything, okay, your problem in McCain County, Pennsylvania, is that you're not getting the preservation needs assessment. If you want a preservation needs assessment in McCain County, Pennsylvania, and you'd like to apply for a grant to get it, please, is my email available here? Because just be in touch with me, and I'll try and you can there are several different places. Thank you, Deani. Just be in touch with me, because there's several different places you could go. We Probably I would help you go for one of the NEH Preservation Assistance grants for smaller institutions, and you'd probably be an ideal candidate for one of their grants for getting a preservation needs assessment. And I would be happy to. I help organizations with those grants all the time. I usually ask them to do a draft, send it to me. I read it over and give a half-hour phone call back, going. Over a very careful line by line, practically reading of the request with recommendations, and lots of places do get funding for this type of type of thing. Deani's sharing that there's a PDF called Ideal Process that you can see in the upper left of the screen, and that's where we have inventory at the very top. If you click on that, if you take a look at that, if you download it, it's a flow chart going down where you start at the top, and first we like to see places that are investing in inventory. You have your inventory done, then you can move to the preservation needs assessment, and then after that you're looking at addressing environmental environmental improvements as recommended in the preservation needs assessment, for going to the higher level cataloging, and from there you can do a nice combination, sometimes combination cataloging digitization project, and also going to the collection surveys where you have the conservator come in and be looking at either broad collections. Sometimes the conservator is looking at a very large collection and they're pulling out some representative samples, or sometimes they're looking at a certain part of the collection and they're pulling out items item by item, where we have several conservators going through a collection manuscript by manuscript, book by book, making condition reports for each of them along with treatment plans. So, and then only after that you get at the very bottom of the chart. I'm afraid conservation treatment is the last thing on the chart, but you just do this incrementally. You do one project at a time. I think I started this whole thing by saying the best way to look at this is trying to figure out bite-sized projects that you do in some type of an order, and the order that we usually recommend here is the order on the flow chart, working your way down the flow chart. Kathy Haas has, it often seems that there are grant sources for conservation surveys, but less for actual conservation work. Yeah, that seems that way to me too. Do you have suggestions of funding sources for the work once you have a survey? If you're a museum, that's pretty easy. The new IMLS Inspire category is absolutely perfect for it. And if it's a larger project, or if you're a larger institution that can't go for that because Inspire is for smaller institutions, with the definition of smaller not really being too precise in there. We're not sure exactly what they do consider small. You can go for Museums for America for conservation treatment. If you're not a museum and you're looking for conservation treatment, it becomes harder. Save America's Treasures is now ideal for that, and they have $5,000 that's going to be available soon, but you do need a collection that is of national significance in order to go for that. And then, I'm only talking about federal funding here, so you might have a state program. Each state has different programs, if they have any. And so for the federal program, the other one that we do go to for conservation treatment, and this is the one where we work with libraries and archives, is the NEH Humanities Collections and Reference Resources. The problem with that one is we have to spin it this way. We have to spin a project in this way for Humanities Collections and Reference Resources. This category of NEH is about accessibility. It's not about treatment. Treatment is a secondary concern. Treatment, in this case, under the HCRR grants, is in order to make sure that the material is safe for the digitization, because what they're really concerned is making the material fully accessible to researchers through digital imaging nowadays. So we frequently work with institutions, especially libraries and archives, who aren't eligible for the museum grants through IMLS, to come up with the digitization project that can be a combination of treatment and digitization. But for libraries and archives, that's if you're a library and archive that is looking for federal funding for treatment, I'm afraid at the moment your only categories are Humanities Collections and Reference Resources, where you have to make a digitization project out of it, or and treatment would be included within that digitization project with them. Or your other possibility is the hope that it's a nationally significant collection, which some archives certainly are, and in that case it might be eligible for one of the new Save America's Treasures grants. And I mentioned back at the very beginning of this, when a lot of people have joined in since I started the forum today, that Save America's Treasures just got a new infusion of approximately $5 million in the latest federal budget. So there will be, last year there were 2 opportunities to apply for Save America's Treasures grants, and I'm hoping that and I'm hoping I'll be hearing shortly about when the next round will be, because they do have money to do it now. And also just a shout out to Megan at the Museum of the American Cowboy, if she's on here. She and I worked with an application for their photograph collection at the Museum of the American Cowboy, the Pro Rodeo collection, and we're still waiting to hear back on whether or not they're going to get funded through that, because they just have an amazing collection of rodeo photos from the middle of the 20th century back, and it would be wonderful to get that funded. So shout out to Pro Rodeo, if they were among the registrants here. So I hope they're getting something out of this, and I'm still waiting to hear if they get that grant because it seemed like a pretty ideal one for them, and it seemed like a real American treasure to me too. I was happy to see them going for that. Question here, if we get an assessment to the value of the collections for insurance, how long is this considered to be usable? A few years, a decade? Okay, assessment value of the collections is useful for certain things, but it is not useful for fundraising in any way, especially with federal grants. Assessments of the value of the collection is actually kind of a red flag for most federal grants because, especially say if you're doing a treatment project that's going to the for a Museums for America grant, for instance, they don't want any indication in there whatsoever that you might be thinking of monetizing the collection, or that you might be thinking of selling something off. The assessment value is important for insurance purposes, but you really, when it comes to fundraising, I don't like to mention value assessments at all. And it's sort of a part of being the conservator, the way a conservator works, a professional conservator. They generally don't want to have any knowledge of the monetary value of the collection because the way that they go about doing their work, the way that they treat how they conserve an object is not supposed to be influenced in any way by the value of the work. Basically, if you are if this is your family Bible that you're bringing in for treatment, you are saying it's very valuable to you as a person. That's good enough. It should get the same care and treatment as a Gutenberg Bible. So that's where the concern. Basically, we try and keep this wall between knowing the monetary value of an object and and the work that we do here. But that wall seems to also exist when it comes to reviewing collections. And like I said, it does kind of raise a red flag. Why are they so interested in knowing how much individual items or whatever in a collection are worth? You get a little nervous at that point that they might have an ulterior motive involved. Oh, we do have a webinar coming up in July with an insurance specialist. I forgot about that. So that's that's on our website, all about that, where you can be involved there. Because there are lots of good reasons for doing the value assessments especially for the insurance purposes, but you just don't usually share them when it comes to fundraising. If you look at that flow chart for collection stewardship concerns and what you're doing there, that isn't a part of it. We are part of a university. Okay, I have a question now. This is from Beverly. We are part of a university, a small part. Would we be eligible for an Inspire grant, or would they consider the size of the university versus the size of the museum? In almost all cases with the universities that I've worked for, the universities, see, this is IMLS, so I'm a little different. I'm trying to back up here for a minute. Inspire is an IMLS grant. We're still trying to read all the tea leaves on what exactly they're looking for with these. NEH has the Preservation Assistance Grant for smaller institutions. NEH has always had that category open to genuinely small institutions or subsets of larger institutions, for instance, as colleges and universities that have their own budget and can be separated out. So in most cases, a library within a university is eligible for an NEH grant for preservation assistance grants for smaller institutions. They can go for that. My guess is IMLS is following the same route with Inspire. On the other hand, they don't have that explicit language in it. With NEH, the explicit language is there saying that they will entertain proposals from the subsets of larger institutions. I don't think IMLS has that in. At that point, I think you would be eligible, and they would go by the size of the museum. But I also think it would be worth your time to send an email to IMLS, one of their program officers, asking the question. My experience with most of the federal programs I'm mentioning here, and certainly this is the case with both NEH and IMLS, is that barring government shutdown, they're usually pretty available to answer questions, that they're actually very helpful and available. So I would recommend sending them an email to make sure that you're eligible for the Inspire grant before you go about going through all the work of actually crafting the application. This is a question from R. Ortiz. Our institution of college doesn't use the term museum, but rather gallery for some of its collections. Is that workable in an application? We have the required full-time staff and operating hours. Oh yeah, galleries. If you are a nonprofit collecting institution that is doing exhibits and is regularly open to the public, you are falling under their definition of what a museum is. You will definitely qualify. It wouldn't hurt you to add museum into your name. It would help your case down the road when you're doing a strategic plan. You might think about changing the museum's name, the gallery's name. But if it's a nonprofit gallery with a mission to exhibit important historical collections, yeah, you would be. I feel very confident in saying that you would be eligible. I think I'll do another shout out here because I had some friends here from an institution who hosted me coming out to work with them on fundraising several years ago, and they're a gallery, so this reminded me of it. So just a shout out to the Withers Gallery and Withers Collection Museum and Gallery in Memphis, Tennessee, who just have a spectacular civil rights and music collection. And it was just an honor to work with them several years ago. And I was really happy to see a couple of people from them down as registrants for this. Getting back to the collection here, yeah, you're part of a college, you're a gallery. I am sure you're doing exhibitions. I would go for it. You're a museum. You can go for it. We're at 2:58 right now on this 60-minute open forum. So I think I've been through all the questions that have come in while I've been here. And like we said, this is our very first time doing this type of a format. So I'm sure we'll be working out the kinks as we go along and getting these a little smoother than my presentation today. We're all just learning here. And if anybody does have any questions, I know Diani shared in the chat here my email, and I'm just in touch with collecting institutions all the time, and I'm always happy to know about collections and your fundraising goals, just your questions. Feel free to be in touch by email at any time, and to ask about your fundraising for preservation collections. And another mention at the very end here that this is the very first event in our Putting Best Practices into Practice Scalable Preservation Solutions program. And I do hope that you do go to our website and take a look into the webinars that are coming up. We specifically were mentioning the one coming up in July on practical insurance considerations for collecting institutions. So please be looking into that and seeing if you want to be doing this. I know what we're all interested in here is going for those incremental improvements, just looking at this over the long haul, assuming you're going to be around for a long time. So let's just start working on improving your collection stewardship in a very thoughtful a thoughtful way. Over the years, you can get a lot done, and getting funding in order to do that is certainly very, very helpful. So be in touch, and I thank everybody for showing up for our first forum.